Thank you very much. I'm here to talk with you a bit today about teaching and how I see that changing now and changing in the future, some challenges that I see, and maybe to present a small solution. I feel incredibly fortunate to be speaking in front of all of you because I realize that you're actually all sort of experts in what it is that I do. That of all the professions that you've spent your time analyzing, watching, critiquing, teaching is probably at the very top of that list. And so before I go on with what it's like to be a teacher in 2014, I'd like to tell you a little bit about how I became a teacher. When I was not born wanting to be a teacher. That's not supposed to be such a laugh line. And in fact, when I left university, I was deeply, deeply, deeply convinced that I wanted to be a professor. And that may not seem like such a large difference to you, but to my 18-year-old self, it was an absolutely huge difference. I wasn't interested in teaching at all. I wanted to be a scholar. I wanted to write books. And I wanted to answer people's questions through a haze of smoke. And so I enrolled in a graduate program studying ancient Greek and Latin and ancient history. And when I got there, I found that the skills that were necessary to become the erudite, slightly eccentric professor that I hoped to be were almost exactly the skills which I lacked, and that I did not have the patience to acquire them. My first year of graduate school was very hard indeed. However, at the beginning of my second year, I was assigned to be a teaching assistant for an Introduction to Latin class. And to tell you a little bit about my 19-year-old self, I was very insulted that I was only being asked to be a teaching assistant and only for an introductory class. But nevertheless, the professor would give one lecture a week, and I would then meet with about 16 students afterwards. For a 60-minute class. I'm sure you're familiar with the model. And one day in November of this year, the teacher had lectured on a case in Latin which is called the ablative case, which is simply the most confusing case in Latin. And it was now my job to explain this to the students and to have them conduct some exercises. It was one of those really, really terrible moments that if you haven't experienced by being a teacher, you may have experienced as a student, when after 10 minutes of talking, the teacher has completely lost the class. It becomes apparent that, in fact, the teacher does not know what he is talking about. If you ever find yourself in this circumstance, I recommend that you simply admit that you don't know what you're talking about. I did not do this. Guys, don't you see what I mean? Weren't you paying attention during the lecture? I stood there, cold and alone. And then from the back of the class, a boy whose name was Steve, he raised his hand, and in about 4 sentences, he summed up the 3 uses of the ablative case and tied them together into a coherent whole. Steve. Oh. I held back tears and was able to ask the class to continue. We went through the exercises, but at the end, in the absolute most heartfelt way I possibly could, I thanked Steve for saving me, for bringing me out of the cold, for bringing me back into the class. And Steve did not say a single word to me that day. He just looked at me and rubbed his knuckles. And this was exactly mimicking something that I had done the week before. Because the week before, when I had taught the lesson slightly more successfully, and we had ended a few minutes early, I had told my class about something that I was learning in my graduate studies, which was a letter that the Greek philosopher Plato had written. And Plato wrote a number of letters. This was the 7th letter that he was written. And so we call it the seventh letter. Most of the seventh letter concerns some events that have been going on in Sicily, and in fact, Plato had gone from Athens to Sicily. But there's a small portion of the letter in which he speaks about something else. And to understand this portion, what I asked my students to think about was to imagine that Plato had received a letter from somebody back in Athens, and that this person had said to him, Plato, you got to get back here, man. There are people in the marketplace that are selling these bootleg versions of your lectures all over town. There are these books, you can buy these books, Plato's lectures. They're selling them at a discount. You've got to come back. You could make so much money with this, and you've got to protect your name. But what Plato says in the seventh letter is he says, my friend, I am not worried about the pirated DVDs of my lectures. Because you know that the true teaching, the things that I really care about teaching, cannot be contained in the written word. That they can only come when two minds rub against each other and through that friction create the spark that kindles true knowledge in the soul. So I thought that Stephen was teaching me about the ablative case. But what Stephen was really teaching me, what Stephen was really reteaching me, was that it's only through the interaction of two minds that true teaching and true learning can occur. And that was the moment that I decided to be a teacher. And I was lucky to move on and to become a teacher. And being a teacher over the last 10 years has meant going to a number of department meetings, a number of faculty meetings. Always the most popular topic is how to teach people to learn for the 21st century. And whenever this conversation comes up, a certain statistic is cited. And the statistic looks something like this. X% of the jobs that we are preparing our students for in Y have not been invented yet. And so we must change the way that we teach. And you can do anything you want. I mean, just so long as X is a large number and Y is a year that's near in the future, you can give your own faculty meeting. And I've been incredibly lucky in my teaching career. Before I came to the American College of Sofia, I taught at a school just outside of New York City, which was a technophile's dream job. Every student had a laptop computer which swiveled around and they could write on it in tablet mode. There was wireless throughout the entire campus. My computer was wirelessly connected to any projector room that I walked in, so I could just hand my tablet to a student and they were writing on the board from their seats. And we had a tech support staff that could fix a broken keyboard with chewing gum and a little bit of string. And I've looked out over a classroom of students, and I've seen them connected to the entire library of human understanding, literally at their fingertips, but totally disconnected from the people who are sitting next to them, cold and alone. Now I feel like I'm losing you. Here I am, TED conference, criticizing technology. But it's okay, because I have Plato on my side. Plato, the founder of the Western educational tradition. And if you don't believe me that Plato said this, go out and read the seventh letter. He wrote it down. You can read that writing cannot contain true teaching. What is Plato doing here? Writing down that writing cannot contain true teaching. What am I doing here? This is the moment that Plato, or rather Plato's teacher Socrates, would have called the moment of aporia, the time when we have no way forward, when I realize that I know nothing. Because if I'm going to argue that true teaching cannot be written down, well, actually, Socrates Socrates may have believed this. After all, after Jesus, of people who didn't write things down, Socrates has had the greatest impact on the Western mind. And in fact, Plato records for us a dialogue between Socrates and one of his students, Phaedrus. And in this dialogue, Socrates tells a story about two Egyptian gods who are discussing the invention of the alphabet. And the first god says, "You gotta get a load of this alphabet, man. This is going to change the world. It's going to make our memories go on forever." And the older god just looks at him and says, "Your alphabet is going to destroy man's memory. It will be the crutch that weakens his memory, for he will never need to use it again." And then Socrates wraps up by saying the story, "So you can see that any man who believes that words are clear and unchanging is a fool." And his student Phaedrus, "Oh." But Plato did write things down. And why he wrote them down and how he wrote them down, I think, can leave us in a way out of our aporia. Plato was essentially dealing with a new technology, the technology of writing. Now, to call writing a new technology in Plato's day requires a little bit of explanation, because we actually think that the first writing of something like Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, occurred, as you can see, about 300 years before Plato. So this would be a little bit like me saying that calculators are a new invention, because they were invented in the late 17th century. I feel like I'm losing you again. But if instead of talking about writing down poetry, and if instead we talk about prose education, I might be a little bit closer. One of the very first Greeks that we knew that wrote down things in prose to pass on information to his students was a man whose name was Hecataeus of Miletus, about 50 years before Plato. Now, we don't have any Hecataeus that I can share with you, or not very much. He was a geographer, but all that survives of his writings are words that were saved by grammarians to point out grammatical intricacies. So his geographical ideas are, by and large, lost. So what was Plato's solution? He wrote down that true teaching could never be contained in writing. But I think the answer is staring us in the face in that dialogue of the Phaedrus. Because what we see is that Plato has hacked the technology of writing. His writing is not dead, it is not cold, it is not stale. It's dramatic, it's a dialogue. And so even though you don't get to be Socrates' student, you get to watch Socrates and Plato and watch their minds rub against one another. And perhaps, if you read very carefully, you can get some of that warmth, and true knowledge can be kindled inside you as well. Now, I don't stand particularly close to the invention of calculating machines, but many people consider Alan Turing, who did some of the work on the very first computers, to be one of the founders of our digital age. And his work is, of course, based on the calculating machines from the late 17th century. One of the first computers, the Manchester Mark I, is from 1949, just about 30 years before my birth. So we stand today at a change in technology that is just as great as the 24 characters of the Greek alphabet offered to Plato. And we face the very same problems, which is that the technology can be cold and distant, but above all, too slick to create the friction. And so, I believe that it is our task to take this new technology of the internet and of digital reproduction and twist it and break it and file it and grab it until it is rough enough to create the friction that we require. Because we need to teach lessons that do not just teach our students how to survive in the 21st century, but how to prevail. And we need to teach lessons that are worthy of a technology that is as powerful as the digital technologies we have at our fingertips. And we need to create technologies that are worthy of our greatest teachings. To tell you that you need to go out and be the Plato of the 21st century, that is ambitious. But I think you have to try. Thank you so much.